tenanted funded, I mean, there's pros and cons. So the pros would be that you tend to have more control. And then the con of it, is that you've got financial expenditure and some risk in relation to controlling of the trades and timeframes and things like that. And I think it's important to remember, and you would see this a lot, is that landlords don't give you something for nothing. So a lot of the time what people don't understand, or what their lawyers aren't very good at explaining to them, is that yes, there can be some incentive to it, but a lot of the time, if it is landlord funded, it can funnel back into the rent payments over a term. So with tenant funded, I suppose that comes up as more of a pro, because it tends to mean that the rent is more accurately priced, I suppose, when the landlord is funding something and putting that incentive.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, from our perspective, we really like tenanted funded acquisitions. And the reason we like tenanted funded is we know that, I'll give you an example. We were doing a property in Toowoomba, and some accountants, they actually did the fit out, and the most beautiful fit out. They had the ceilings done, and they had these beautiful shapes in the ceiling and downlights and carpets and all of this. And I mean, they had just spent over $150,000 in an office, and we just took one look at it. Now, from our perspective, if we see the tenants are prepared to spend that amount of money in somebody else's building, well, that's a big investment, which means that they're invested in staying there. Okay? So that immediately for us is tick, one of the great tick boxes. You know, depending on how old the fit out is and how long the tenants have been there. This was actually, the tenants had been there for about 12 years, and they had this new fit out installed probably about 2 years prior to us purchasing this property. And it was really lovely, because we had the conversation with them, and they were very invested in staying, but they wanted to make sure that their rental was accommodating, obviously, market rental, which was fabulous, because we were getting market rental and they paid for the fit out, to the tune of $150,000.
Do you see, Mish, from your side of things, because we deal with the same transactions, but we see them from different sides. Do you see it where tenants do fantastic fit outs, and they, so their rent is market rent without it being beautiful. They make it beautiful. And then when the market review comes time, do you see their rent go up in relation to how the improvements that they've done with the property, or does that not tend to happen on the negotiation side of things?
Not necessarily. I mean, if the tenant's going to do a fit out and they're wanting the landlord to participate in the funding of that fit out, generally they would do it at the time, and they would advertise that into the rental somewhere, so they'd make an arrangement. And I think that's where you come with the next section, which would be landlord funded or shared cost. But generally, if we're purchasing a property and that fit out has already been done by the tenant, and the rental is market relative, there's no question about it. So
yes. So I mean, tenant funded is easy from a legal perspective. And then landlord funded, obviously that's where we get involved a little bit more. And we usually do incentive deeds. So
explain that a little bit. What is incentive deeds?
Yeah. So incentive deeds is basically a deed that sits alongside a lease that outlines some sort of incentive. And there is a commercial reason why landlords tend to do that rather than put the incentive in the lease. And that's because leases over 3 years long, including options, ought to be registered on title. So if we're thinking of, contracting with all different parties, based on what the economy is doing at the time, is going to change how you negotiate as a landlord. So let's say, with a certain person, you give them a certain amount of fit out incentive. you might not necessarily want to do that in 5 years when the market's shifted. So if you put that incentive in an incentive deed, there's no need for that to be registered on title and open to the public. If you put it in the lease, everyone can see how you've negotiated that incentive, and they're going to want the same thing if you're not offering them the same thing.
So what do you see as the disadvantage? Because, I mean, when you say everybody's going to see that in the lease, why would that be at a disadvantage?
If it's a disadvantage for the landlord if it's in the lease, because if you no longer want to offer that incentive, they're going to say, oh, but you got that incentive 3 years ago. Why would I contract, or why would I enter into a lease with you if I wasn't going to get the same? So that's one of the reasons why incentive deeds are used. And there needs to be careful drafting for both sides. So careful drafting for the landlord, but careful reviewing from solicitors from the tenant's perspective. So I've got a good story about a landlord-funded fit-out incentive, actually, and it could have ended quite badly for the client if the solicitor, if we had just ran over it and thought, great, you're getting $300,000 for this fit out, that's fantastic, you don't have to pay for it. But on the terms of the fit out, so basically the story was that our client was entering into a lease for a cafe, and it was in quite an upmarket area, so it required a pretty good fit out, and it was a big space. So the landlord said, okay, I'll give you a $300,000 fit out incentive. But with that, what they failed to advise is that they didn't do it in stages, and they weren't willing to pay for it up front. So what the tenant would have had to have been done if we didn't review and amend it would be that the tenant would have to front $300,000 to the contractors, builders, electricians, then provide the evidence to the landlord, and then the landlord would have paid the incentive back. And yes, some people have $300,000, some tenants have that to put up. But in our client's case, he didn't want to move his cash into that at that point. The second thing that we had to work on was that, and it happens with a lot of incentive deeds, is that they'll draft really strict, and I do the same thing, you draft really strict terms in relation to timeframes. So with this one, and we all know construction works at its own timeframe, it's, they're not really going to care what your timeframe under your incentive deed is, but the timeframes were really strict, and basically they could claw back the incentive deed if you didn't meet one of the timeframes of construction. So not only
the landlord could claw back the incentive. Okay.
Yes. So then you're in a position where the client's stuck in a lease, a large lease. They may have expended a certain amount of cash, and then the incentive's clawed back, but the lease isn't terminated. So you're still stuck in the lease.
Ouch.
But you've now lost $300,000. So on that one, we really had to, it was hard negotiation too. They really didn't want to move on it. It took about 3 months of back and forth. But where we finally got to was, okay, tenant, how much can you expend at certain times so that it's not going to affect your cash flow? And let's try and get them to agree to installments. And they did. At the end of the day, they agreed to the installments. So the tenant did have to fund sections of it or portions of it, and then the landlord would refund them the amount. And then also we had to heavily negotiate on the timeframes. And it was just a matter of, we can't put a client in this position with these timeframes where they're relying on a third party to do something within a certain amount of time. It's the risk to benefit ratio is way out. So that was successful, but you could see how quickly it could have gone bad if someone had just thought, yeah, that all looks fine, you go just sign your life away.
It's so funny that you're telling us that story, and thank you for sharing that. Because it's, we often think, yep, that sounds good, absolutely, let's go ahead, let's do that. And when you start getting into the nuts and bolts, and it's all about the money, this is nothing about the money, but it's all about the money.
Yeah, 100%.
And at the
end
people
of the day, get blinded.
Yeah, and who pays what, and when do they pay it? That is exactly what we're doing all day, every day. So it's the most important thing. So just on that landlord funding the reno, did they negotiate that the tenant
No, not on the face of it. So it wasn't, it wasn't sort of a you pay this off as you go. It was really this is a nice building. This is a dilapidated part of the building. If you're willing to take this sort of term with this sort of rent, and most likely it was inbuilt somewhere. That's what I was saying before, and the tenant funded probably a bit early, but sometimes, and you would understand this more from what is the market rent on it. You have to think, is it built in? Are they getting it back somewhere along the line? But it wasn't obviously sort of payable by the tenant at any stage.
Well, that's pretty unusual. I mean, that must be really unusual. And obviously the landlord could see the value, I'm assuming, by contributing, by uplifting his property. And I would love to know what the rental was, because it must have elevated his rental, elevated his value,
Yes. It was quite high. It would actually, and because we don't really get involved too much with the marketability of where the rent sits, it would be really interesting to sort of have a discussion on that, because I think even though they're not being obvious with it, they're not putting $300,000 in it for nothing. So usually, as you're saying, it would sort of flow through the rent over the term.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, if it's 300,000 over a couple of months, it's capital invested. I would imagine that the landlord is reallocating the rental straight into offset the uplift, which is taxable deduction. On the building itself. While you increase the value, you've got a depreciation value and taxable income on their property. So for him, it's a win-win.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now I know.